Today's video comes from a request from one of my students to talk about debtors confirmations. Now, a debtors confirmation is also sometimes called a circularisation. So what exactly is it? Under ASA and ISA 505, it's a form of external confirmation where we write to a third party and ask them to confirm some information that we've obtained from the organisation. So we're looking to confirm something we already know. Confirmations need to always be written, and for debtors they can take two forms. The first form is a negative confirmation, and a negative confirmation is when we request that somebody only write back to us when the information is incorrect. The other form is the positive confirmation. So the positive confirmation requires the sender or recipient of the letter to write back regardless of what the result is. So ASA 500 actually says, so in ISA 505 paragraph 15, that we really don't want to use negative confirmations. It says there that they're not a great persuasive form of evidence, because the negative confirmation, if somebody doesn't write back to us or say anything about the letter they've received, we assume it is correct. So no response equals assume the information is correct. But of course, there are a number of reasons why somebody might not respond. The company might have gone out of business, they might have changed address, and that certainly wouldn't help us in terms of confirmations. But the positive, we must wait for a response. So let's talk about why sometimes we see the term circularisation. We see the term circularisation sometimes because the letter will start with the auditor, go out to the client, to the customer. The customer will fill it in, or whoever's receiving the confirmation, the recipient, and then send it back. So we call it circularisation because it goes from the auditor to the recipient, they fill it back in, and it comes back to the auditor. So that's sometimes why it's called a circularisation, but it's often called a confirmation as well. Now, standard audit practice is to have confirmations on every audit. All right, so confirm AR on every audit. A little bit later on, I'll talk about some alternatives we can use to confirmations, but we are seeing some changes in practice where audit teams can elect to do something else, can elect an alternative procedure. And I'll talk about those alternative procedures and why we might use those alternative procedures a little bit later. So let's talk about how the confirmation process actually works. What happens is the auditor obtains a list of debtors. All right, and the debtors will have all of their names and all of the amounts owing. Then the auditor will select a sample. Now, as part of that sample selection process, the auditor might decide to stratify the sample. So they might break the population into, for example, large customers, medium, and small. And they want to select a sample of those letters, those debtors to send a letter to. So once they've selected their sample, then they're going to generate the confirmation letters. All right, so I'm just going to use the flowcharting document here. They'll generate lots of confirmations for a number of our sampled customers and then send them off in the post. All right, so that gets mailed plus a return reply paid envelope, gets sent off in the post to the debtor. We hope that the debtor replies. So this process here doesn't take very long. Then I'm just going to sort of do a bit of a circle here. We wait for responses. Now, what if nobody has responded? All right, let's say we wait 2 weeks. All right, if after 2 weeks people haven't responded, we send out our confirmation again with the reply paid envelope. Now, if the debtor does respond, then, so if we get a response, all right, then we have to determine whether the response is correct. Okay, because sometimes the client might send some information to us that is incorrect. So we need to determine whether the response is correct. If the response is incorrect, or if we don't get a response, so this is response, otherwise no response. If there's no response, then we need to engage in an alternative audit procedure. So this process can be quite costly for the auditor. This part here, in terms of selecting the sample, is not expensive, but we need to generate the letters plus an envelope for the entire thing and postage. Then we have to wait for responses. If we don't get any responses, we go back and we do this process again. So the confirmation process can be up to a 4 to 6 week time period. So it can be quite lengthy, and it can get quite expensive because of all of these costs. So what is the purpose of our confirmation? If we're going to have a confirmation and it is expensive and it is time consuming, then what's the purpose? Well, if we think about our assertions, if somebody does write back, a confirmation will prove existence of the debtor. It really is a real company that owes us money. It'll give us some information on the valuation of the accounts receivable. However, the caveat there is that the valuation of accounts receivable, it's only a one-way test. And it's only for overstatement. So why is that the case? Well, imagine if you're the customer. All right, so customer owes client $150,000. All right, so if the auditor confirmation states $200,000 balance, then the customer is likely to write back and say, no, that's not correct. It should be $100,000. The alternative, so if we've overstated accounts receivable, we're very likely to get a response. But what happens if the confirmation amount is 100,000? If the auditor sends a letter and says, okay, customer, even though you owe 150, the auditor thinks you owe 100, then the debtor is unlikely to respond. So we're only providing a test for overstatement, not for understatement. This particular test also doesn't give us any information on completeness of accounts receivable, nor does it give us any evidence on rights and obligations. So it is a test that we've done over a number of years. Confirmations have been done for most auditors that I know as long as they can remember to help us with existence and valuation, but only for overstatement. If we're worried about understating of accounts receivables, then we need to consider some other tests. So we've got this evidence. It has value for existence and it has valuation value. So let's talk about relevance and reliability. Because under ISA and ASA 500, we need to make sure our evidence is sufficient and appropriate. And this comes under the appropriate part. All right, part of appropriate is that evidence must be relevant and reliable. So is it relevant? Well, we've certainly talked about the existence assertion, and we've talked about the valuation assertion that it's helpful for. But the question here becomes as well, is it reliable? So we know customers won't report an AR understatement. All right, that's an issue. Another issue that we need to consider is that we make some assumptions about the quality of the internal controls at the debtor. All right, we assume that those internal controls are able to gather and collect evidence about the purchases that debtor has made, the payments that have been made, to generate an appropriate balance. So we assume that they have a good internal control system. We assume that they have knowledgeable staff. And we assume as well that they could be bothered to reply. So some research was published and done back in 2002 where somebody did actually go away and put in incorrect information in the confirmation, so incorrect numbers, and very few people actually picked up, number one, replied, or actually picked up or returned information about the misstatement of accounts receivable. So we make a lot of assumptions in terms of the reliability. So what can we do as an alternative procedure? Because if somebody doesn't respond, then we have to have some form of alternative. And that alternative is what's often called the subsequent cash receipts or subsequent collections test, where after our end of financial year, we look at payments made in this period here and we vouch them back to accounts receivable. All right, so we vouch them back to accounts receivable records that existed at the end of financial year date. And so if somebody paid 5,000 here, and we look back and we find that their accounts receivable back here was 5,000, then that's correct. And that we've got a test that's an alternative to our confirmation. Now, the subsequent cash receipts test is very quick to do. We come in after the end of the financial period. All we need is the cash receipts or cash journal, the accounts receivable, and we can match those back quite quickly. That would be a task for somebody in only a couple of days, compared to my confirmation process that we have back here that can take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. So in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, I personally believe that the subsequent cash receipts process is a lot more reliable, relevant, and timely form of evidence than our confirmations. So I hope you found the video useful. The next one in this series is going to talk about provisions for doubtful debt, so keep an eye out for that. Have a great day.